Yes, there is a serious possibility that if the United States wasn't there, and even with the United States there, that Japan and China could get into a fight over what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands and the Chinese call the Diao Islands. No, you do not want to underestimate the potential for trouble.
And you believe those conflicts would have been there even without the United States? Because earlier you said that a lot of these conflicts are because of the polarization in geopolitics. For instance, the AUKUS, for instance, this sort of massive encircling of China, including United States way down into Australia.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think if the United States was not in Asia at all, that there would still be a conflict over the border between China and India?
Nation states would have had conflicts about border states. About India and China, definitely there are 4,000. But let me qualify. No, the qualification is important, because if not for the United States, the conflicts would have been treated as border conflicts. And as you know, that China has already resolved peacefully about 10 border conflicts out of 14.
It's irrelevant. There is an intense border conflict between China and India.
Yeah, but wouldn't you make
that I think it has nothing to do with the United States. And you could take the United States away and you'd still have that border conflict.
The border conflict has nothing to do with the United States. I agree. It was because there were two empires which broke down, and out of that nation states emerged.
But it's not the United States.
But the polarization. No, what I'm saying is that the larger polarization of Quad, of AUKUS, using different bases in the Indian Ocean, that is precisely because there is the presence of the United States. Indians wouldn't have dared going, even talking about encircling China without the United States.
That's a different issue. The point that we were debating to begin with was whether or not the Japanese and the Chinese would be at loggerheads over the East China Sea, and in particular over those tiny islands, right? That was the question. And you said that if the United States was taken away, right, then the conflict would basically disappear.
No, I didn't say that.
No, you didn't say
I said if the United States were not there, especially in the East China Sea and South China Sea, then the conflicts would have been lower intensity and limited to border conflicts, which we have seen in the case of Central Asia, for instance. There were a lot of border conflicts, quote unquote, with China and a lot of former Soviet Union Central Asian states. A lot of them have been much more peacefully resolved because they were treated as border conflicts.
You haven't been able to peacefully resolve the Indian border conflict with China. You haven't been able to peacefully resolve the conflict over those islands. This is basically a zero-sum game.
Yeah, but what I'm asking, Professor, is that the polarization makes it worse. So, for example, in the precise case of India and China, if you look at the years before 2014, and it massively escalated since 2017 or 18 when Chinese and Indian soldiers, came to blows in the Himalayas, during the interim period, before that, there was a much sanguine and much, less nationalistic limping forward towards the resolution of the conflict.
You know why that's the case? Because China was not a great power. What's happened here is China turned into a great power. And when it became a great power, it became more aggressive. And the more powerful China becomes, the more likely it is that it's going to try and shove a border settlement down India's throat. That's the way great power politics works.
So then,
this is why I said it was not in India's interest, it was not in Taiwan's interest to turn China into a great power. I remember when I went to Taiwan in 2014, I had a one-on-one conversation with the president of Taiwan, President Ma. And President Ma was very interested in interacting with China and helping the Chinese economy to grow. I told him this was a major mistake. You're going to turn China into a great power, and China has its gun sights on Taiwan.
Also, a lot of Taiwanese businesses were contingent on China's rise.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And he said that was a good thing. And I said, from a geopolitical point of view, that does not make sense. But this is exactly what happened with India. The problem that India faces now, and I've talked to a number of Indians who recognize this, is that China is getting more and more powerful. And in fact, one could argue the gap between India and China is widening. And this is bad news for India, because great powers tend to try to settle things with coercive threats or sometimes with military force when they get to be really powerful.
I guess here we read the situation a little bit differently. I mean, I think the escalation happened precisely because the Hindu nationalists came to power, which meant a much more aggressive form of nationalism in India. And on the other side, with the Pakistan, because also the gap between India and Pakistan has increased. And now that you have disempowered the Muslims in India, you need a bigger piece for the Hindu nationalists to galvanize your nationalism. But that's an internal view of how I look at the situation.
You're switching the focus to the India-Pakistan conflict. We're talking about the India.
No, I'm saying that's important if you take an internal view, as I do. My internal view is that the escalation since 2017 doesn't reflect an escalation of asymmetry, as you said, but more than that, a change in internal domestic policy of India, which made nationalism the central piece.
That may be true. But we weren't talking about that.
Of course, no.
About India and China.
Yeah, no, because your explanation was that India-China conflict has escalated precisely because the gap has increased. In fact, if anything, I look at what my field is economics, I would say economically speaking, not in terms of specific technology, not in terms of military, but economically speaking, I think we have seen the peak of asymmetry between China and India. India is most likely to grow at a much faster pace. I'm not getting into the nature of growth and all of that.
All I will say is I hope you're right.
So then I think a good pause here, and that would probably help us segue into Russia and Ukraine and others, where I think we agree. I mean, I think this is the only case that we disagreed on, and I think, like in diplomacy, people say begin with something that people agree on and then move into disagreements. But I think in marketing, it is said that show the most interesting things to the customer at the beginning, and so I think that's where I started, but let's discuss a little.
I like disagreement, so
absolutely, yeah.
That we disagree.
Yes, and a part of the reason why I'm focusing on other things is that a lot of other alternative media spaces where you go on a regular or a periodic basis, with whom we have tremendous solidarity with, and it's been like such a great work. You have been speaking up a lot there, and I didn't want to like make you repeat everything. So that was also part of the reasons why I was not just was, but I'm trying to focus on other aspects. Also, that I read your book. So, Professor Mearsheimer, let's talk about the Soviet Union for a moment, because I felt while the Chinese case is a kind of theory and speculation, and while the case of France, you didn't discuss Britain as much, but one can add that into the soup. The United States, Japan, and so on is a very solid history about regional hegemony. I have a question about the Soviet Union. I have no quarrel with you that the Soviet Union was a regional hegemon when looked at from the perspective of East Europe. And Hungary in 56 and Prague in 68 were just moments where those relations were clarified. And one can also take a step back and see that history in the region of East Europe has not judged the Soviet Union very favorably, even though there has been a change of politics that one should take into account. But my question to you is that if one goes beyond East Europe and looks at Soviet Union's engagement in other parts of the world, and you know the history better than I do, would you define that as an aggressive expansion comprehensive history. And I'm asking this because there is this mainstream view about the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was an empire. I know that's not important for your category of analysis, but was it aggressive? Since aggressive realism is definitely your category of analysis. Would you define that as aggressive?
I think the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a global security competition over the course of the Cold War. The intensity of that competition was greater in some areas.
Soviet Union was an empire. I know that's not important for your category of analysis, but was it aggressive? Since aggressive realism is definitely your category of analysis. Would you define that as aggressive?
I think the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a global security competition over the course of the Cold War. The intensity of that competition was greater in some areas than others. For example, it was the greatest in Europe, but it was also intense in East Asia, and it was intense at different points in the Persian Gulf. In fact, the United States built the Rapid Deployment Force in the late 80s and early 90s to deal with the possibility that the Soviets might invade the Persian Gulf. So those were the three main areas. And I think both the United States and the Soviet Union were aggressive in the loosest sense of this term in that competition. And that certainly included the competition in those three areas, but also it included places like Africa. There was a competition, for example, in Angola.
Mozambique, Ethiopia.
Yes, it was a global competition, and we were trying to take advantage of the situation to best the Soviets, and they were doing the same thing. So in a very important way, we were both behaving in aggressive ways.
I think this is a very good point for me to ask you a little bit about the theory as well through history. One of the things which bothers me about realist theory of international relation is that it doesn't seriously take into account the internal dynamics. And you mentioned Africa, for instance. If I were to choose between Portuguese colonialism and in Angola, in Mozambique, or even the U.S. client states in the 70s, early 70s, before the Drake government came in with the support of the Soviet Union in Ethiopia, we on the left, we take a position because we think that the Soviet Union support in these cases, and I'm being very specific because I, for instance, don't think that Soviet Union's intervention in Afghanistan was defensive, and we can go into greater detail why I don't think that. But in these cases, we read the history as a defensive for one thing, and for the other thing as a progressive step. How would realist theorists respond to this kind of reading? Are we completely stupid? Are we wrong? Or there is something that realist theorists miss out on?
Well, the question you have to ask yourself to start is, what's the subject we're talking about here? And you like to talk about imperialism and colonial empires. And my point to you is realism doesn't have much to do with that. What realism
that's precisely my question. Is that a weakness in the assessment?
No, because theories focus on specific subjects, right? You could have a theory on how the brain works that doesn't tell you anything about how your heart works. Or you could have an overarching theory that talks about how the whole body functions. So the question is, what's the scope of your theory? And the scope of realist theory is great power politics. Right?
And it doesn't matter the nature of power. It doesn't matter how the pieces at the periphery respond to them.
That was just my first point.
Right.
My second point is that you are correct that realist theory of the sort that I put forth do not pay any attention to domestic politics. You're correct. But what you have to understand is that a theory is a simplification of reality. And what you do when you construct a theory is you say, I believe that A and B, or just A or just B, are or is the most important factor for explaining how the world works. And you leave other factors on the cutting room floor. They're outside of your theory. They're not in your theory. And of course, that's what I do with domestic politics or ideology,
right,
or individual leaders. They don't matter. I have a structural theory that basically treats states as black boxes. Now, we all know that the real world is one in which domestic politics sometimes matters a lot. And in those cases, the theory will be proved wrong. And no theory is right all the time. My intuition, and I want to underline the word intuition, is that if your theory gets it right 75% of the time, you're in the Hall of Fame. Okay? But that means your theory is wrong 25% of the time. Okay? So, let's assume my theory is right 75% of the time. Let me brag about my theory. It's right 75%.
You have the right to brag. You have got it correct in so many cases.
That means I'm wrong 25% of the time. That means in 25% of the cases that we examine, my theory will be proved wrong, because one of those factors that I left on the cutting room floor have jumped up and bit me in the hiney. And a perfect case of that would be the Israel lobby. Steve Walt, who's also a realist, and we wrote this book, as you well know, on the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy. And it's a book that basically says domestic politics drives U.S. policy towards Israel.
Right.
That contradicts our theory. And in fact, what we're saying in the book is that American policy vis-a-vis Israel is not in America's strategic interest, right? That contradicts realism. So I don't dispute that my theory is sometimes wrong. It's sometimes not an accurate it does not sometimes provide an accurate explanation of what's going on in the world. That's just the way theories are. Now, one final point. I believe that domestic politics sometimes matters, but I do not believe that a theory based on domestic politics has as much explanatory power as a structural realist theory. That's my basic line of argument.
I'll come back to that, but I wanted to ask you here, how do you think about the question of morality? Does it even fit in here? And I think why I'm asking this question is because a lot of people who, including myself and a lot of my comrades, who find your work on Russia, on Israel, on the Middle East, so helpful. And sometimes people don't read your work, they just listen to your YouTube videos, and so they don't understand where you are coming from. I of course think I have a better sense of that since I have read your book. Ideally, morality shouldn't have any place in that kind of realist analysis. Nevertheless, I still wanted to ask you, because a lot of the times, what do you make of people like, or maybe I'll just ask you to respond and then I'll ask follow-ups if I have.
There's no room for morality in my theory. It's very important to understand that. It's not an immoral theory, it's an amoral theory. There's no question about that. But every human being, including a realist like me, has a moral compass.
Absolutely.
And when I look at the world, there's no question I use my realist theory to explain how great power politics works. There's also no question that I use my moral framework to think about how the world works. And sometimes my moral framework and my realist framework line up perfectly. They point in the same direction. Sometimes my realist framework is largely irrelevant because we're not talking about great power politics. The example I always use in this regard is the Rwandan genocide. I was in favor of going into Rwanda to shut down the genocide, but it had nothing to do with great power politics. So it was...
No one was interested.
Yeah, it was the unipolar moment. The United States was incredibly powerful. So it was my moral framework that mattered, period, right? But then there are cases where what is the morally correct thing to do and what is the strategically correct thing to do from the point of view of realist logic clash with each other. And in those cases, in international politics, states will pursue what is in their strategic to do from the point of view of realist logic clash with each other. And in those cases, in international politics, states will pursue what is in their strategic interest, and they'll put moral interests or moral considerations aside. But again, there are going to be lots of cases where the arrow, so to speak, points in the same direction. And the Israel-Palestine case is a perfect example of that. It's not in our strategic interest to support a genocide in Gaza. It is also, from a moral point of view, bankrupt in the extreme for the United States to support a genocide in Gaza.
And when you say as an individual you have a moral compass, let's say, we're not talking about individual behavior, but let's say we're talking about social systems, economic systems, is it largely based on some idealistic models, or do you really endorse some countries' internal systems over others? I'm asking this question because, for instance, someone like Noam Chomsky would think that the Soviet Union didn't have a good system. He was very critical of it. He also doesn't think that China has a good system, but he would always emphasize that the problem was not the Soviet Union. I mean, he recognized that, of course, in East Europe, they were expansive or they were hegemonic, but by and large, when he spoke about Vietnam, when he spoke about Nicaragua, he said that Soviet tanks are here not because they're expansive, but because we are forcing them to. The kind of analysis that you would have on Ukraine, for instance. But as I read his work, I found that he has an idealistic picture, anarchist, syndicalist socialism, or however you'd like to define. Do you have any such internal system that you would endorse?
I was born and raised in a liberal democracy called the United States of America. I thank my lucky stars I was born in the United States. I'm a big proponent of liberal democracy. However, I do not believe that we should be running around the world trying to turn other countries into liberal democracies. I believe if other countries want to have a semi-authoritarian or soft authoritarian or even a hard authoritarian government, that's their business. I have what I would call a very liberal view of regime type. I want liberal democracy for the United States. I'm an American citizen, and as an American citizen, I can, I can have a say in what kind of political system we have. But I don't believe I should have a say in the political system that Russia has, for example. If the Russians have an authoritarian system, I would call it a soft authoritarian system, so be it. That's their business. And the last thing I want to do is run around the world trying to make everybody look like the United States. Because I think in the end, that is, in essence, an illiberal foreign policy.
Absolutely.
Because it does not tolerate difference. And I think, in fact, the United States, throughout the unipolar moment, when it was trying to make the world over in its own image, when it was trying to make the world look like the United States by spreading democracy with color revolutions and so forth and so on, we were pursuing an illiberal foreign policy, although the proponents of the policy described it as liberal. So I have a hands-off policy towards other countries and the political systems that they choose, with one exception. And that is, if I see a genocide, like in a place like Rwanda, or even a place like Gaza, I would be willing to intervene. I think there, genocide, mass murder, I would be in favor of intervening. But in terms of the actual regime type that these countries have, I just don't care that much. It's their business.
I think, talking about liberal democracy, one of the things within the left circles, comrades would ask, what in the United States do you admire? And I often used to say the First Amendment, perhaps. And we are living at the moment where the First Amendment is under serious threat from very many directions. Do you think in the history of the First Amendment, historians would look back at this moment and would say that Israel was seriously a massive threat to the long history of the First Amendment in the United States?
I think there's no question that not so much Israel, but the Israel lobby here in the United States has become the principal threat to free speech in the United States. It's almost impossible to talk about Israel in a critical way in the United States and in the West more generally.
And do you think this is like an unprecedented development? I mean, Noam Chomsky used to say that in the 60s and early 70s, it was difficult for him to give lecture on Palestine because he needed bodyguard. But a lot has seemed to have changed in the process. There was anti-Vietnam mobilization and all sorts of things. Do you think this is something which is kind of very new to the United States, where you can't criticize a foreign government?
It's not new in the case of Israel. There's no question about that. It was there a long time ago, certainly in the 60s, and certainly Chomsky has suffered as a consequence of this taboo. There's no question about it. It's just gotten much worse, right? And the problem is that Israel's behavior has become more outrageous over time. Right. And as it's become more outrageous in the age of the internet, where people are aware of what Israel is doing, the lobby has to work harder and harder. The lobby has to work overtime to prevent people from criticizing Israel. So the extent to which the lobby now goes to shut down free speech is unprecedented. But again, getting back to your point about Chomsky in the 60s, it's been there from the beginning. And Steve Walt and I lay this out chapter and verse in our book.
I think I want to ask you a little bit on the new developments on U.S.-Russia relationship. And there was a time when a lot of people, including people like Jeffrey Sachs, thought that Trump seriously wants peace with Russia. So my first question is, do you think Trump seriously wants peace with Russia? If yes, why is it? Because a lot of people says it is to de-link Russia from China and maybe even Iran. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's no question that Trump wants peace with Russia. He wants to end the Ukraine war. Whether he can do it is another matter. We can talk about that. Your question is why? I think there are a variety of reasons. First of all, he understands that we've lost.
Right.
It's time to cut our losses. Furthermore, he understands that from Ukraine's point of view, it would make good sense to end this war rather than continue it. Because if we continue the war, more Ukrainians will die and they'll lose more territory. Third, I think he believes quite correctly that Russia is not a serious threat to the United States. Indeed, it's not a serious threat to Europe. And fourth, I think he believes that there are all sorts of advantages to working with Putin, which you described, which is that if you're interested in shutting down the Iran nuclear program, getting some sort of agreement with the Iranians, it would help to have, cooperative relations or good relations with the Russians so that they could cooperate and help you in this endeavor. And in terms of dealing with China, although it's probably not possible at this point in time, given the bad blood between us and the Russians that has existed for so long now, but it would be good to try to have better relations with the Russians and peel them away at least somewhat from China. Maybe more Ukrainians will die and they'll lose more territory. Third, I think he believes quite correctly that Russia is not a serious threat to the United States. Indeed, it's not a serious threat to Europe. And fourth, I think he believes that there are all sorts of advantages to working with Putin, which you described, which is that if you're interested in shutting down the Iran nuclear program, getting some sort of agreement with the Iranians, it would help to have cooperative relations or good relations with the Russians so that they could cooperate and help you in this endeavor. And in terms of dealing with China, although it's probably not possible at this point in time, given the bad blood between us and the Russians that has existed for so long now, but it would be good to try to have better relations with the Russians and peel them away at least somewhat from China. Maybe get the Russians not to be allied with the United States or linked with the United States, but at least get the Russians to be neutral, to sit on the fence. Try to do that. And I think that's one of his goals. I think that will be extremely hard to do. But I think those reasons explain what's going on here. And I think they're all good reasons. I think Trump's instincts on the Ukraine war and on U.S.-Russian relations and on how we should deal with Putin are basically, and I think they're all good reasons. I think Trump's instincts on the Ukraine war and on U.S.-Russian relations and on how we should deal with Putin are basically correct. Right. I think his instincts on a lot of other issues are terrible, but on this one, I think he's on the money.
I think then the million-dollar question is, why is he so helpless and unable to move forward? I guess I remember about 2 weeks ago when we chatted last, and I asked at that point in time, Professor Mearsheimer, do you think the April 20 ceasefire can work? Because it seems like it's not working. And your response was there ever a ceasefire? Would you please explain what you meant and why is it not working then?
Well, let me just talk about why he's not been able to come close to getting an agreement and then talk about the ceasefire. The problem that Trump faces is that the Russian demands are hard to swallow. The Russians insist that Ukraine cannot be in NATO. And indeed, there can be no security guarantee between the West, especially the United States, and Ukraine, because that's like de facto NATO membership. So that's the first Russian demand. Second Russian demand is that Ukraine has to give up at least the 4 oblasts that Russia has annexed and Crimea, which Russia has annexed. And then the third demand is that these are the major demands. The third demand is that Ukraine has to demilitarize to the point where it has no offensive military. It has no capability to threaten Russia militarily. Basically is not an offensive military threat to Russia. So that would involve substantially disarming, not completely disarming, but substantially disarming Ukraine. Those are the 3 demands. And Trump has to swallow them. And he's not been able to do that.
Not even the first one, because Pete Hegseth had said that there is no question that Ukraine shouldn't be in NATO. So Trump doesn't swallow it.
He appears to have swallowed that. He appears to even have swallowed the one on territory, right? But he has to explicitly swallow all three of them. He has to say, these demands are demands that I accept. He may do it, but he has not done it yet. He's hinted at that. So until he does that, you have no overarching peace agreement, which is really what the Russians want, and I believe Trump wants. But you also don't want to underestimate the extent to which the Europeans, the Ukrainians themselves, and a huge chunk of the Western elite is adamantly opposed to Trump even negotiating with the Russians, much less accepting Russian demands. So he has his work cut out for him. And he's not exactly a Machiavelli, right? You need a Machiavelli here to make this work. Somebody who's really smooth, really sophisticated, like Lyndon Johnson in his heyday. And that is not Donald Trump. He is the anti-Machiavelli. So that's the general peace agreement. You ask about the ceasefire. Well, they had these negotiations, right, to get a ceasefire. What the Americans and the Ukrainians wanted was an overarching ceasefire. They wanted to shut the war down temporarily, an overarching or comprehensive ceasefire. The Russians have made it clear there is not going to be a comprehensive ceasefire until we reach an agreement. Until we reach an agreement where you accept our three principal demands. Why? Because the Russian military is on the move. They're winning. They'd be crazy to agree to a ceasefire. To let the Ukrainians, reconstitute their forces, rearm, makes no sense. So no comprehensive ceasefire. The Russians and the Americans, working on the side with the Ukrainians, did craft what looked like two ceasefire agreements, one involving the Black Sea and the other involving attacks on energy infrastructure in both countries. The one regarding the Black Sea has never been formalized, so there is just no agreement there, no ceasefire there. We can go into the details if you want. And then with regard to the ceasefire involving energy infrastructure, the Ukrainians have been violating that on a daily basis. So it's a meaningless ceasefire. It was only a 30-day ceasefire anyway. So you had these two small ceasefire agreements, one of which never resulted, and the second one, which in effect never resulted. So you have no ceasefire. And you're not going to get a ceasefire because the ceasefire that you really need is a comprehensive one. And you won't get that until you get a general agreement for a peace deal.
During the announcement about the tariffs, I didn't see Russia being named there. And please correct me if I'm wrong. One of the conditions on one of those partial ceasefires, I guess it was on the Black Sea, was Russia saying that one of the conditions should be our access to international markets, especially of fertilizers and food, which would also mean to revoke the sanctions of their agricultural banks through the SWIFT system. Do you think Trump might be willing to take all these sanctions back?
Trump is. It's the Europeans who wouldn't do that. You're right. The Russians said, with regard to the Black Sea ceasefire, that it was necessary for the main Russian bank to be able to engage in economic intercourse, which meant taking the sanctions off and have access to the SWIFT system as well. And the Europeans said, no, can't do that. So the Europeans and Trump were at loggerheads, and the Europeans won. And therefore, the Black Sea Agreement never went into play. So
would it be fair to say that Europe is now one of the biggest impediments to the normalization talks?
Yes. I put it a bit more specifically. I'd say that the biggest impediment are the Ukrainians themselves.
Right.
and right behind them in second place are the Europeans. With some exceptions like Viktor Orban and Hungary. But your basic point is, of course, correct.
My final question on Ukraine, Professor Mearsheimer, I guess you have spoken about it, but I think it's important. And if you can take a sip of water as I speak. You have mentioned about the color revolution earlier in this conversation. Can you talk a little bit about how you
said no, can't do that. So the Europeans and Trump were at loggerheads, and the Europeans won, and therefore the Black Sea Agreement never went into play.
So would it be fair to say that Europe is now one of the biggest impediments to the normalization talks?
Yes. I put it a bit more specifically. I'd say that the biggest impediment are the Ukrainians themselves.
Right.
And right behind them in second place are the Europeans. With some exceptions like Viktor Orban and Hungary. But your basic point is, of course, correct.
My final question on Ukraine, Professor Mearsheimer, I guess you have spoken about it, but I think it's important. And if you can take a sip of water as I speak. You have mentioned about the color revolution earlier in this conversation. Can you talk a little bit about how you see has been the impact of, or let's say how you would define Western Ukrainian nationalism, and does it have any, whether strategic or moral or political, any legitimacy in the larger scheme of things that we are discussing?
I think there's no question that Ukrainian nationalism is a remarkably powerful force. And I think one of the principal reasons that the Ukrainians have continued to fight against the Russian war machine, despite suffering enormous casualties, is because of nationalism. Their commitment to the country, to the motherland, to the fatherland, their commitment to fighting is truly impressive.
Now, I guess I didn't frame it well. I was thinking about the change in nature of Ukrainian nationalism since 2004, then again in 2010, and of course, very massively since 2014, that kind of a shift towards the far right. I mean, of course, there was a Ukrainian nationalism, which was not necessarily as hostile. I mean, there was a section of that which was, of course, remarkably hostile to Russia from the very beginning.
But nationalism has been there from the beginning. If you go back to 1991, the nationalism has been there.
Of course.
What you're talking about is where the political center of gravity is.
Right.
It's a somewhat different issue. You could argue that as Ukraine has moved to the right, that nationalism has become more virulent, and it's a more virulent form of nationalism. You can make that argument. But there's no question that has been there from the beginning. If you go back to 1991, the nationalism has been there.
Of course.
What you're talking about is where the political center of gravity is.
Right.
It's a somewhat different issue. You could argue that as Ukraine has moved to the right, that nationalism has become more virulent, and it's a more virulent form of nationalism. You can make that argument. But there's no question that Ukraine has moved to the right.
And that generates a lot of contradiction in the East. And that's something I thought is important in this regard. Because as Ukrainian nationalism shifted towards right, contradictions in Eastern Europe got intensified, and the Russians perhaps have bigger incentives to intervene.
Yeah, I mean, it really this problem breaks out into the open, festering below the surface for sure, but it breaks out into the open in 2014. In February 2014, you have the Maidan Revolution, and Yanukovych, Viktor Yanukovych, who is the leader of Ukraine, is effectively overthrown, and he is pro-Russian, and he ends up actually going to Russia. And then the leadership that takes over ends up instituting a series of laws involving language that people in Eastern Ukraine can use. And of course, in Eastern Ukraine, you have lots of ethnic Russians and lots of Russian speakers. So a conflict shortly after the February 4th, 2014 crisis breaks out, a conflict starts in the East, an armed conflict. You effectively have a civil war in the East. It involves ethnic Russians and lots of Russian speakers on one side, and on the other side you have basically ethnic Ukrainians, and that's an ongoing conflict.
I think it would be
the East, an armed conflict. You effectively have a civil war in the East. It involves ethnic Russians and lots of Russian speakers on one side, and on the other side you have basically ethnic Ukrainians, and that's an ongoing conflict.
I think it would be important for me to ask you about Iran, given the situation seems to be very tense. I think my specific question here would be, how do you understand as the talks around Iranian nuclear policy? Because some people think it's just about weapons, and then they follow a set of arguments and lines. And I guess some people are talking about not just weapons, but also enrichments and what they would vaguely call as nuclear capacity. I'm very curious how you look at what these talks around Iranian nuclear policy mean at all.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk about whether or not Iran has a nuclear weapon or not. And that's really not the issue.
That's settled, I guess, that they don't. And
they do not have a nuclear weapon. Yeah. But what they do have is they have the capability to easily build a nuclear weapon. And to be more specific, they have the ability to enrich uranium, so you get weapons-grade fissile material, and they have the ability to reprocess plutonium. And those two capabilities mean that Iran, if it wants, can develop the bomb, right? Now, the JCPOA, which was the nuclear agreement between Iran on one side and the United States, France, Britain, Germany, Russia, and China on the other side, okay? All the members of the Security Council plus Germany on one side, Iran on the other, came up with an agreement, the JCPOA, 2015, during the Obama years. There is no question that that agreement prevents Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't take away Iran's enrichment and reprocessing capability. And the reason that the Israelis hate the JCPOA and push Trump to pull out, which he does in 2018, in the summer of 2018. Remember, the JCPOA is consummated in 2015, and Trump pulls out in 2018. And it's mainly because he believes, or probably because the Israelis convinced him, that it's a terrible agreement because it has, it allows Iran to keep its enrichment and reprocessing capability. So that's really the issue. So Iran today is not building a bomb. At least nobody has evidence that it's building a bomb. But
including American intelligence.
And I'm sure Israeli intelligence as well. But the problem is, what spooks the Americans and the Israelis is that they're reprocessing uranium up to 60% now. And to go from 60% to 90% is a short jump and easy to execute. And once you're up at 90%, you're producing weapons-grade fissile material. Mm-hmm. So this scares the Israelis and it scares the Americans. And we want the Iranians to give up that capability. The Iranians have told us that that's the brightest of red lines, and they will not give it up.
I guess I'd be interested to know what does giving up that capability mean? I suppose it doesn't mean not having uranium, because they are supposed to have a civil nuclear technology. And as I understood, I went to an engineering school, and we were told at that point in time, look, the cutting edge technologies are this, and that. A lot was told about coding. A lot was told about developing missile delivery technology in space and so on. And one of the things our professors said, that nuclear technology is not really a very cutting edge technology at this point in time. So what does taking away nuclear capability mean? If you could explain that.
Well, the idea is you would take away their ability to enrich uranium. If you have a standard, nuclear reactor and there's safeguards on that reactor, you can't build a nuclear weapon because you can't
enrich it to a very high,
or reprocess it if it's plutonium, right?
Right.
That's right. That's exactly right. So having a nuclear program per se doesn't matter. The United Arab Emirates has a significant nuclear program, and the United States has no problem with it because we have an agreement with the UAE such that they do not have access to the technology that would allow them to produce fissile material. Mm-hmm. And what we want to do is we want to create a situation, certainly the Israelis do, where Iran cannot produce the fissile material that's necessary to produce a bomb. And that involves the enrichment capability and the reprocessing capability. So, tomorrow, Saturday, in Oman, the Iranians and the Americans are going to get together and try to work out a deal, an agreement. And I don't see what viable agreement is out there to be had, because the Americans and the Israelis will insist that Iran give up its capability to enrich and to reprocess, and the Iranians won't accept that. So what kind of deal is Trump going to get? I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something here. But it would seem to me if they get a deal, it will probably look like the JCPOA, which mm-hmm. Trump pulled out of in 2018, because, again, it allowed Iran to enrich and reprocess.
Do you think that the extreme kind of language that Trump is using here, will bomb you and so on and so forth, is this a kind of pressure tactic that he had earlier used in the case of North Korea? And there were some positive developments. It went nowhere, but I interviewed Professor Bruce Cummings, and at the time he said that I can see some glimmer of hopes. Do you think it's a pressure tactic, or do you think he genuinely believes what the Israelis believe, that there should be a regime change, like what happened in Syria?
Regime change is a different issue. I actually believe that Israel's ultimate goal is not simply to eliminate
the
nuclear threat in Iran. It's to turn Iran into a Syria-like country. It's to break Iran apart.
But what is Trump's belief in this, if we can...
Trump wants to get a deal. The last thing Trump wants is a war over Iran. I don't think Trump wanted a war over Iran a month ago. But after all of the turmoil in the world economy, the last thing he needs is a war with Iran, because no one knows what the escalation patterns will look like mm-hmm. in that war. And of course, in eastern Ukraine, you have lots of ethnic Russians and lots of Russian speakers. So a conflict shortly after the February 4th, 2014 crisis breaks out, a conflict starts in the East, an armed conflict. You effectively have a civil war in the East. It involves ethnic Russians and lots of Russian speakers on one side. And on the other side, you have basically ethnic Ukrainians. And that's an ongoing conflict.
I think it would be important for me to ask you about Iran, given the situation seems to be very tense. I think my specific question here would be, how do you understand as the talks around Iranian nuclear policy? Because some people think it's just about weapons and then they follow a set of arguments and lines. And I guess some people are talking about not just weapons, but also enrichments and what they would vaguely call as nuclear capacity. I'm very curious how you look at what these talks around Iranian nuclear policy mean at all.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk about whether or not Iran has a nuclear weapon or not. And that's really not the issue.
That's settled, I guess, that they don't.
And they do not have a nuclear weapon. Yeah. But what they do have is they have the capability to easily build a nuclear weapon. And to be more specific, they have the ability to enrich uranium, some limits. So you get weapons grade to Iran. I think if Trump feels that a war with Iran makes no sense, even if the Israelis put enormous pressure on him, I think he may be able to resist. He may not. You do not want to underestimate how powerful the lobby is.
In the event of a war, I hope there isn't any. Is there any way we can guess what the attitude of the Russians and the Chinese would be?
Well, a lot of people ask the question, will the Russians and the Chinese come to the aid of Iran militarily? And I think the answer is no, at least in terms
Chinese would probably definitely not come in.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, more if any one of those two countries were to come to the aid of Iran militarily in terms of direct involvement, it would clearly be the Russians. But the Russians are up to their eyeballs in alligators in Ukraine. The last thing they want to do is get involved in a war over Iran. So I think what would happen is, I think diplomatically, economically, and militarily, China and Russia would go to great lengths to aid Iran. I think militarily, the Russians would provide them with all sorts of equipment that would help them, deal with Israel and deal with the United States. I think they're already doing that, by the way. I think they're giving the Iranians
Trump missiles and so on.
The
S-400.
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly which systems they're giving them, but they're giving them air defense systems, communication systems, and helping the Iranians get ready for a possible attack.
I'm coming to an end. I wanted to ask you a question about the rest of the global South. Now that the picture is very clear that the United States and China are going to have a very rough relationship for some time.
Yes.
And of course, there is a global impact of that given the size of these two economies. I mean, out of a $120 trillion global economy, these two economies share like $50 trillion. And so it's, even if you roll back like 185 tariffs, there is a lot there. And so you are seeing that in the response of the markets, both the stock markets and the bond markets. My question to you is something that you haven't often written about because you focus so much on great power politics. But we coming from the global south, and we increasingly see that China is also qualitatively different from a lot of those in the global south economically, in particular, if not politically. We come from a tradition of non-aligned movement, and there is a rich tradition in India, but I think large parts of Africa and elsewhere, that a good way to navigate within inevitable great power politics is to stay equidistant. My question is, do you think that's possible today? And do you, if you were to policy recommend global south countries, would you agree with that in general? Of course, there are very specific cases where people need to ally.
Yeah, I think that it does depend on the country, for sure. But I think generally speaking, if you're another country in the system and you have to deal with the Chinese and the Russians, you want to do everything you can to not get too close to either one of them. Henry Kissinger is said to have said once that there's only one thing worse than being America's adversary, and that's being its ally. And I think there's some truth in that. And if you look at the Europeans today, I think you see that they're finding out that having faith in the United States has not worked out very well.
Or Ukrainians.
Yes, we're Ukrainians, right? So I think, I'm a realist, and realists believe that this is a self-help world. Countries should take care of themselves, or take care of themselves as much as possible. Sometimes you need a benefactor, or you need an alliance. Even the United States needed NATO during the Cold War and assorted other alliances around the world. But you want to do everything that you can to make sure that as an individual country, you're as powerful as possible, because it is a brutal world out there. So that's my basic view on that issue.
Yeah, I guess I asked this question because I had in mind mostly South Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I feel like I agree with you that while the situation for South Korea or Japan is more complicated, but I do genuinely believe that the situation in South Asia, but even in Africa and Latin America, it's relatively easier. And I think that spirit of non-alignment is more important than ever for these regions, looking at what we are seeing unfolding now, because I think it would be wrong to see these just as tariff wars now. Now, the scale to which it has escalated between the United States and China.
Yeah. But a good example that I think illustrates the point that you're getting at is actually India. India, as you know, has a rich history of good relations with Russia. And when the war broke out in Ukraine, the United States went to great lengths to put pressure on India.
Because they're buying a lot of oil along with the Chinese, Russian oil.
Yeah. Well, but what the United States wanted was for India to become an adversary of Russia and to side with Ukraine. And the Indians understood, of course, this would be remarkably foolish. In part because they would get now all this oil at a cheap price, as you described, but also because historically the Russians have been important allies, and that's very important for India, right? So India was not getting too close to the United States. It was keeping the United States at a distance, which is very smart in the context of the Ukraine-Russia war. However, the Indians have to worry about the Chinese. And you and I focused on the border dispute before, but you want to understand that's not the only potential flashpoint.
Indian Ocean.
Indian Ocean, exactly, right? The Chinese are building a
but that's where I think that explains my point, that while the borders are more internal to Chinese and the Indians, the internal ocean, the Indian Ocean is more part of a larger geopolitic.
There's no question about that. There's no question about that. But the point is, the Indians have a vested interest in having good relations with the United States.
That's
for a variety of reasons, but one is because of the Indian Ocean. they also need help from the United States. The United States can't give too much help, but some help with regard to the border dispute in the Himalayas between China and India. So India has a vested interest in not getting too close to the Americans when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But with regard to China, it has an interest in getting closer. But again, not too close because they're all in BRICS together, right? And the Chinese want to have good relations with, the Indians want to have good relations with the Chinese in the context of BRICS. They want to have good relations with the Russians in the context of BRICS. So you can see the Indians are walking a fine line here, right? It's a very tricky situation for them. And I think that's true for a lot of countries around the world. If you're Indonesia, for example, Indonesia has the fourth largest population in the world. If it can get its per capita GNP moving steadily upwards, it will become a very rich country. What it wants to do is imitate what China did. Okay, but to do that, Indonesia has to have very good economic ties with China. It really matters. But from a strategic point of view or a military point of view, we're talking about Indonesia, which is in the South China Sea, which China wants to turn into a giant Chinese lake. So the potential for conflict is ever present. So Indonesia has to think about how it's going to deal with its geopolitical problems with China. And there, the incentive is to move closer to the United States. But that's not in its economic interest. Anyway, all of this is to say that the Indonesians, the Iranians, the Indonesians, the Indians, South Koreans are another example. We could go on and on.
Vietnam.
Vietnam, exactly. These countries all are in a tricky situation. And as you pointed out quite correctly, this will all be exacerbated by the trade war that's now taking place.
My last question, I promised that was my last question. What about the traditional allies, the Canadians, the Japanese, the Europeans? Because there was a point in time where people were saying that the U.S. has betrayed us, especially in Europe and Canada, not as much in Japan, because Japan seems to be like its hands are much tightly tied. But now it seems that the U.S. is ready to make some concessions, at least with regards to the tariff. I don't know about NATO, but it seems to me if the Europeans cave in and contribute more to the NATO budget, the U.S. might be willing to continue its traditional relationship. So my final question to you is there a fracture emerging within the West, or is the traditional West led by the U.S. continuing? How do you look at it?
I believe there is a major fracture that is now taking place in relations between the United States and the Europeans. I believe that since the United States was granted its independence in 1783, or since it declared its independence in 1776, up until roughly 2017, Europe was the most important area of the world for the United States. East Asia was of secondary importance, nowhere near as important as Europe. And that's because the most powerful states on the planet were in Europe, not in East Asia. Japan, Imperial Japan, was nowhere near as powerful as Nazi Germany, okay? And that's why transatlantic relations have always been of primary importance to the United States. But that world has gone away. There's no country in Europe that threatens to dominate all of the continent. There's no Nazi Germany, there's no Soviet Union, there's no Imperial Germany, there's no Napoleonic France. There's no threat in Europe of any real consequence. In contrast to the situation in Europe, in East Asia, you have China. China is a peer competitor. It is a remarkably formidable country. The United States has never seen a competitor like China, right? So what the United States has done for the first time in its history is it's made East Asia the most important area of the world. And that's why we talk about pivoting to Asia And implicit in that comment is we're pivoting away from Europe, pivoting to Asia. This is one of the reasons that Trump wants to put an end to the war in Ukraine and wants to improve relations with Russia. His Secretary of Defense, Peter Hegseth, has made this point very clearly, right? So what we have happening here is a fundamental shift in American strategic priorities. And the focus now is on China. And I believe that the U.S.-China competition will be the defining feature of international politics for the rest of this century. And
that's why Philippines is becoming so important to the United States.
Of course. And even India, right?
Of course.
Right. The Quad, AUKUS, all of these, institutions that are now being put in place are designed to, from an American point of view, to deal with this remarkably powerful and impressive China. Now, just a quick word on allies and how America deals with its allies. Putting aside the fact that Trump treats all allies badly, he treats our East Asian allies better than he treats our European allies. And the reason is
the shift.
We need our East Asian allies, right? We don't need our European allies the way we once did. You can make an argument we need the Europeans for certain reasons, but not as much as we need our East Asian allies.
Especially if you are not focused on Russia as much as a Biden would do.
Absolutely. And what Trump wants to do is he wants the Europeans to deal with Ukraine. He wants the Europeans to deal with Russia because Trump wants to get out of Europe by and large and focus on Asia. There's just no question about this. But it's very important to understand what a profound shift is taking place in American foreign policy. And I think many elites and many people in the public as well in the United States find this hard to grasp because we have been brought up over the decades to believe that Europe is the most important area of the world to the United States outside of the Western Hemisphere. And that was true, as I said, up until about 2017. But that world has gone away. And East Asia is just much more important to us today than Europe is.
In terms of Chinese nationalism, there is this idea that, at least I do more economics and economic history, so it's much stronger there, that Chinese look at it.
I believe there is a major fracture that is now taking place in relations between the United States and the Europeans. I believe that since the United States was granted its independence in 1783, or since it declared its independence in 1776, up until roughly 2017, Europe was the most important area of the world for the United States. East Asia was of secondary importance, nowhere near as important as Europe. And that's because the most powerful states on the planet were in Europe, not in East Asia. Japan, Imperial Japan, was nowhere near as powerful as Nazi Germany, okay? And that's why transatlantic relations have always been of primary importance to the United States. But that world has gone away. There's no country in Europe that threatens to dominate all of the continent. There's no Nazi Germany, there's no Soviet Union, there's no Imperial Germany, there's no Napoleonic France. There's no threat in Europe of any real consequence. Mm-hmm. In contrast to the situation in Europe, in East Asia, you have China. China is a peer competitor. It is a remarkably formidable country. The United States has never seen a competitor like China, right? So what the United States has done for the first time in its history is it's made East Asia the most important area of the world. And that's why we talk about pivoting to Asia. And implicit in that comment is we're pivoting away from Europe. pivoting to Asia. This is one of the reasons that Trump wants to put an end to the war in Ukraine and wants to improve relations with Russia. His Secretary of Defense, Peter Hegseth, has made this point very clearly, right? So what we have happening here is a fundamental shift in American strategic priorities. And the focus now is on China. And I believe that the U.S.-China competition will be the defining feature of international politics for the rest of this century. And
that's why Philippines is becoming so important to the United States.
Of course. And even India, right?
Of course.
Right. The Quad, AUKUS, all of these, institutions that are now being put in place are designed to, from an American point of view, to deal with this remarkably powerful and impressive China. Now, just a quick word on allies and how America deals with its allies. Putting aside the fact that Trump treats all allies badly, he treats our East Asian allies better than he treats our European allies. And the reason is
the shift.
We need our East Asian allies, right? We don't need our European allies the way we once did. You can make an argument we need the Europeans for certain reasons, but not as much as we need our East Asian allies.
Especially if you are not focused on Russia as much as a Biden would do.
Absolutely. And what Trump wants to do is he wants the Europeans to deal with Ukraine. He wants the Europeans to deal with Russia because Trump wants to get out of Europe by and large and focus on Asia. There's just no question about this. But it's very important to understand what a profound shift is taking place in American foreign policy. And I think many elites and many people in the public as well in the United States find this hard to grasp because we have been brought up over the decades to believe that Europe is the most important area of the world to the United States outside of the Western Hemisphere. And that was true, as I said, up until about 2017. But that world has gone away. And East Asia is just much more important to us today than Europe is.
In terms of Chinese nationalism, there is this idea that, at least I do more economics and economic history, so it's much stronger there, that Chinese nationalism for a very long time, at least since the 80s, at least since the end of Cultural Revolution, has a very significant economic component to it, by which we mean that development is a very, very important focus. And I can go through all the 90s and 2000s. I don't think I should now. That more than ideology, more than everything else, development has been the focus because that has kept the legitimacy of the party in place. And there is a lot more to be done because for one thing, if not anything else, development hasn't been even in China. The difference between the Western provinces and the Eastern coast is roughly 2 to 3 times in terms of GDP per capita. There are also larger problems with the Chinese economy that are emerging. And so some people argue, those of us who at least look at China internally and focus on economics, is that there is a sense of economism within Chinese nationalism that keeps it away from the kind of American nationalism or European nationalism, all of which which comes in indirectly in the case studies that you did. Do you find any substance in that regard, in this line of argument?
I think nationalism is a generic concept that applies to China, the United States, Russia, Germany, Vietnam, in the same way. I mean, there's some minor differences on the margin, but the generic concept fits in all of these cases. And China, of course, is a remarkably nationalistic country. But let me just say a few more words about that. You emphasize, I think quite correctly, that the elites in China want to develop the country. They want to pursue a development strategy that works, because that helps keep them in power.
Yeah.
Gives them legitimacy.
It's very different from the United States, where you can come and just roll out a bunch of tariffs without caring anything for the capital markets. I mean, we haven't seen that kind of.
I don't think you want to generalize to the United States based on what President Trump recently did.
Okay. Yeah. No, fair point.
But American elites, by and large, care about development. They care about generating prosperity.
They do. And the markets have pushed back even Trump.
Of course. But the point is, because they want to stay in power. So I'm agreeing with you. But you do not want to underestimate that there are two other reasons that leaders are interested in development. One, and it's the most important, is that prosperity translates into military might. And military might is important because if you're interested in surviving in a brutal international system, you want to be powerful. So you want to develop, right, economically, so you can translate economic might into military might and you enhance your prospects of survival. You want to remember that when China was weak, you had the century of national humiliation.
Of course.
The causes of the century of national humiliation, the cause was Chinese weakness. And the problem is that they were economically backward compared to the developing West. So there's that security rationale as well as the domestic political rationale. But the other reason is that if you're the leader of a country, you just have a vested interest. Forget the politics in making sure that your people are prosperous. They're your people. You want them to lead a nice life, or at least a decent life.
Right.
So I think if you're a Chinese leader, you're worried about your political position. You're worried about the welfare of your body politic, and you're worried about the security of your body politic or your nation state. And all of those motives push you to work very hard to develop your economy. And, we were talking before about cutting edge technologies. If you're the Chinese, you have a deep-seated interest in being on the cutting edge of all these new technologies that are out there, as do the Americans. If you're Indian, you have a deep-seated interest in getting out there with the Americans and with the Chinese. I often see all these Indian scientists and engineers who are coming to Silicon Valley. I would think from India's point of view, they ought to create their own Silicon Valley and keep those scientists and engineers there. Why? Because if you're on the cutting edge of the world's leading technologies, that generates wealth, which means it generates prosperity. It's good for the body politic. It's good for the people of India or China or the United States. So I would just add to what you said by bringing in those other dimensions.
Professor Mearsheimer, it has been an incredible honor to have you on, and thank you so much for your